Ladies and gentlemen, selamat sejahtera dan selamat sepupu. Sepupus, today we have a very special appearance from Mr. James Chin. Hello, James, and welcome to my podcast. James is a familiar face for those of you who A, use Voice of the Rakyat on Facebook. I know some of you out there. Shout out to you. Read Channel News Asia. He is a very frequently featured columnist, which you may see like right over here. Professor of Asia Studies, if I'm not wrong, at the University of Tasmania. He is a person of many, many interests that converge in our conversation today about Malaysian politics. And James, it's an honor to have you on this podcast. So thank you for being a part of this.
Hi, Victor. Good to be here.
Thank you. Great. So, James, it's your first time appearing on this podcast. I know that you have a podcast of your own. I'd like to start with showing you a picture. We begin right here with a little bit of tears. Here we are at this historical moment right after Mahathir retires from his prime ministership, 2002. And how the world has changed ever since then. Now, I want to get your insights and a little bit of your thoughts. How do you feel that Malaysian politics has changed ever since that era?
I think that's a really, really good question to start our conversation. So I think if you look back in Malaysian politics, essentially you can sort of split Malaysian politics into three very distinct phases. The first one obviously was start of nation building, started from 57 onwards, going basically up to the May 69 riots. During that period, we had a sort of an experiment with multiracial politics, and then we even brought Singapore in. They stayed for 2 years before they decided to get out. And of course, everything changed from 69 onwards. So that's the first phase. Second phase is sort of a second period in nation building, but the difference between the first phase and the second phase is, of course, after 69, lifting of Parliament emergency rule, you had the creation or the attempt creation of what is known as a Malay state. This was made very, very clear a few years later by the former MP who gave a very important speech in Singapore where he talked about the social contract and how Malaysia is a Malay state, whether you like it or not. And of course, the most important period in the second phase was the ascendancy of Mahathir in 81 when he became the Prime Minister, and he stayed on for more than 2 decades. So that was the period when he really cemented the Malay state. So the Malay state was really built during his period. And of course, the third phase that we're living through now is post-Mahathir period. But of course, some people argue that we actually have a fourth phase, which is after 2018, after the whole fall of the Barisan Nasional. You can argue that, but I would basically argue we're still living through the post-Mahathir stage, the third stage. So what are the key lessons to be learned? I think the important key lesson to be learned is that I think one of the things that Mahathir made, he made lots of mistakes, but I think the key thing was that because he stayed for so long, I think Malaysians today will not accept a leader that will stay for 20 years. I think that's quite clear, whether you're young or old. I think people have come to a situation where they realize that you cannot allow a political leader to stay for such a long period. I think that's the first thing that came very, very clearly. And I think the other thing that came out very clearly that the so-called Malay state that Mahathir was building, which was based on UMNO base. It's interesting that he himself turned against UMNO, as you know, in 28, sort of played a major role in that power. So even though he doesn't admit to it, right, the fact that he went against UMNO suggests to me at least that the structure that he built himself, he actually ended up regretting it. I think that is the second thing. And I think the third lesson that we learned during Mahathir's era is that, you really can't play with racial politics and religious politics in terms of political Islam. You can't play with that sort of thing and expect Bangsa Malaysia. As you know, in the second half of his rule, he was very big on Bangsa Malaysia. He really thought you can build a Bangsa Malaysia and still split the country into Bumiputera and non-Bumiputera. So I think it's quite clear that at the end of his rule, he had some time to reflect. He realized that it doesn't work. So that's the reason why he has sort of, since he fell out of power in 2020, he's sort of gone back to this very strong Malay dominance, Malay state thing. I think he has more or less given up on Bangsa Malaysia. In fact, I haven't heard him talking about Bangsa Malaysia for many years unless he was asked a question about it. I'm talking about he
For
himself
sure.
mentioned it. And I understand that you spoke to him recently. You actually managed to get a podcast with him. All I know is that we're living in a very interesting age, post-Mahathir age, where everything that we see in Malaysia today, I would argue, had its foundation during the Mahathir era. Not only the physical stuff like Petronas Tower, KLIA, but the political culture that we live in through. If you were to dig a bit deeper, everything sort of came out from the Mahathir age. But it's interesting that as the years go by, some people argue that although he's still very influential, I would argue that Malay political culture has really undergone a transformation, and I don't think he is happy about it. I think we see a very clear, emergence of class politics and religious politics in Malay. And I think this is something that the non-Malay community are trying to understand. A lot of people do not want to understand it, but I think it's really, really important that the non-Malay community understand it, because you will have to live with this whether you like it or not.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. You know, it's funny that you say that we're in the post-Mahathir era, especially when, the man may have been in power and no longer is formally in power, but, he recently crossed his 100th year. And, of course, he's still making all of those statements that he continually makes over the course of time. And all of those patterns, like how when it came to like Tunku Abdul Rahman, some might say that he had a hand there, under Razak, Hussein on, and then subsequently his own administration, everything was essentially shaped around the will almost of like a single individual. Very interesting character for sure. So, Prof, when you think about this Mahathirist paradigm that we're in, he's just crossed 100. How do you feel that that is kind of even currently, right? Like shaping the environment that we are in at the moment. It's definitely a very different time from before, and I have some thoughts on that as well. But what are some things that you can immediately see at the moment?
Right. So I think one of the important things is I think people should not buy into the social media hype. The social media hype is that, Mahathir is still very influential. Part of it is because he's still attracting a lot of media. He is what we call a political icon. So whatever he says, whatever statements he put out, people report it. But if you speak to the political class, nobody wants him to come back. So you can argue that the opposition is using him as a political mascot to rally all the anti-Anwar forces. When the chips are down, I doubt very much that they will turn to him and say that, can you lead us in the next election? It is quite clear the last time around he set up a so-called Malay umbrella group called GTA. All of them lost. He himself lost his deposit. It is remarkable. The reason why I say it's remarkable is because anybody who knows Malaysian history know that he single-handedly built Langkawi up to be a tourist island. Before that, Langkawi was nothing. And yet, the Langkawi people, rural people who depend on the government to keep the tourism industry alive in Langkawi, they turned against him. He not only lost, but he lost his deposit.
Oh, yeah.
So this is really remarkable. So you can see that, the political class that pay homage to him when he calls a press conference, Pas show up, Bersatu shows up, everybody shows up. But when the chips are down, I doubt very much they'll turn to him again. They're just using him to rally the anti-Anwar forces because they know that he has spent his entire life, his entire political life, trying to stop Anwar from being the prime minister. So now that Anwar is the prime minister, he's still dead set on pulling Anwar down. Now, I'm sure he still has some political ambitions, and I'll argue that a lot of people misread his political ambitions. A lot of people say that, he dreams of becoming the prime minister, all that sort of thing. I don't think so. I think his political ambition lies in trying to keep the Mahathir legacy in the political arena through the children rather than they himself, right? We know that his son Mukris is quite political, and there are other people in the Mahathir family who sort of have some political ambition. So I think his political ambition is really sort of retain the Mahathir dynasty. But I think the Malay community as a whole, I think they have moved beyond Mahathir. One of the things you have to remember about Malay political culture is that once you reach a stage like Mahathir, a political icon, right, people still respect you, even if they don't agree with you, right, they
Mm.
would do it in public. Malay politics is what they call very halus, very polite. So they will not disagree with in public. But my interactions with the Malay political class suggest that they don't take him seriously anymore. I
Mm.
think because of social media, people realize that the mistakes he made when he was in power, especially the second time around, 2018 to 2020, he made too many mistakes.
Mm.
And especially among the younger Malay group, those who were very, very excited about Refugee, they never forgave him for causing the downfall of the
Mm.
Pakistan Harapan government 0.0.
Mm.
If you just, if even if you are not part of the political class, it is very clear the reason why that government fell apart was because Mahathir resigned suddenly. He thought that the Agong will reappoint him, but the Agong did not. The Agong ended up appointing Muhyiddin to be the prime minister. So he totally miscalculated. If he had
Mm.
stayed on, if he had not resigned, right, nobody else had the power to force him to resign. People don't realize that under the Malaysian constitution, right, even the Agong can't force the prime minister to resign. The only way you can force a prime minister to resign is if he has lost a vote of no confidence on the parliament.
Mm.
Or if he had not sent in the letter, he would have hand on, and the Pakistan government, some form of Pakistan government, may have been able to survive. But again, people were blaming him because it is very clear that he can give all sorts of excuses. But I'm here to tell you that the major reason why he did not give up power was because he did not want Anwar Ibrahim to be the prime minister. Because if he had stepped down, there was a very clear consensus and pre-2018 agreement that
Mm.
Anwar would take over after. So he kept hanging on. That's the reason why he did not want to give up power. And that's one of the major reasons why everything imploded.
Mm. Thank you for that. You know, it's interesting because like that push almost for Anwar to step down, it seems right now that it's continuing even as he fights with, for example, lawyers like Rafiq Rashid, for example, in fighting for like judicial independence and so many other interesting things that we're seeing him continue to do nowadays. But in sort of moving into this idea of legacy, I'd like to show you another video clip so that maybe we can put things into perspective with even more tears.
Masalah yang tidak ada ini mengancam kehidupan orang lain. Saya tak boleh terima negara kita nak kepada orang lain saya tak boleh. Ini negara kita bertahan.
So, Prof, when you look at this, right, do you think that maybe there's a part of that that is genuine? I know that you talk a little bit about how maybe he wants his family to, you know, remain in the political game. But of course, we see also like that whole Anwar, you know, opposition branch out there. But you also see that fight for judicial independence. Of course, you could argue that maybe, well, he fought against the judiciary during the time of Tun Saleh and everything. But how do you read his intentions and like, what do you see him kind of like moving towards at the moment?
So I think whatever it does, you have to take it with a grain of salt. He will jump on any issue that he thinks that will be useful in helping to pull down Anwar. So the latest issue that makes everybody angry is of course the judiciary. But as you mentioned, he's being hypocritical here because he was involved in the removal of Saleh Abbas as the Chief Justice. So look, he's in the opposition now. He knows he's in the opposition. So he will jump onto any issue at all which he thinks will sort of weaken Anwar politically. So the latest issue that will weaken Anwar politically is, of course, the so-called allegations against a very senior judge who people think are going to be appointed as Chief Justice. So that's the reason why he jumped that bandwagon. But the clip that you show was quite interesting. I think at the end of the day, Mahathir is a Malay national in the sense that he really wants his own race. He regards himself as pure Malay. He wants his own race to be the political masters of this country called Malaysia. I don't think he has ever accepted the concept of a plural state. At one time, as I mentioned earlier, he was very big into Bangsa. But even if his concept of Bangsa Malaysia is still a Malay-dominated Bangsa Malaysia. So what do I mean by that? What I meant by that was that he truly believes that all the key institutions, the executive, armed forces, royalty, whatever you want to call it, right? At that point in time when he believes in Bangsa Malaysia, he was quite happy for one or two tokens Indians and non-Malays to head one or two departments, but the core departments will have to be held by the Malays. In other words, the non-Malays at the maximum you can reach number two, but you can't reach number one. So even at his so-called most liberal phase when he believed in Bangsa Malaysia, that's what he meant by his version of Malay state. Now, of course, he's hardened his approach. And I think the reason why he has hardened his approach because I think he worries about the younger Malay turning away from this hardcore. I think it's extremely important for people to understand his approach to Malaysia and his approach to how he sees the non-Malays. It is quite clear that the way he sees the non-Malays is basically through the lens of there are sort of four core issues that the Malay nationalists see the non-Malays, the way they see through the lens. The first one is that they think that the non-Malay community do not accept the concept of national unity. The problem is that their concept of national unity is based on Malay dominance. And they think that the non-Malays cannot accept it, and therefore you cannot accept national unity. The second thing is that they see the non-Malays, especially the Chinese community, as too selfish to share their commercial knowledge to help the Malays in the business world. And very often they link this to ungrateful behavior because they say that, we Malays, right, we've always been quite generous to the Chinese. So, for example, at the time of independence, even though a lot of Chinese can't even utter a single word of Bahasa Melayu, we did a deal with the British. We granted more than 1 million non-Malays and gave them citizenship. So they said that if you look at history, no other country was as generous as we were. But of course, there were other countries in a similar situation. The third point is very important is that they've always accused, and Mahathir has said this many times, that the non-Malays, especially the Chinese, do not want to assimilate, right? And do not acknowledge the Malays as the indigenous people of Asia. So this is a very, very important point for the Malays. So for the Malays, right, as people like Mahathir, the nationalists, they regard assimilation as the only way for the non-Malays to show that they're loyal to Asia. The problem is that in many other parts of the world, for example, in Thailand and the Philippines, right, the Chinese or the non-Filipino Thai community were able to assimilate because there was no religious requirement. In Malaysia, there's a religious requirement. So that is a barrier, but they do not want to discuss that barrier. They just said that you do not want to assimilate. And the final point that they are always very angry about, and Mahathir has also expressed this a few times speeches when he was Prime Minister, is that the non-Malays, again, especially the Chinese, are always challenging the social contract and the official status of the Malays and the so-called official status of Islam. Again, if you understand these 4 points, the way he looked through his lens, and I have to tell you, right, these 4 points that I've just mentioned, right, this is actually the mainstream Malay view. It is not Mahathir's view, but it is the mainstream Malay view. But Mahathir is, in a sense, very important in this process because he sort of reinforced this view when he was in power for 20 years.
Oh, yes.
So until today, right, the Malay community is become part of the mainstream Malay political psychology. So that's the reason why very often I think the non-Malay community, especially the Chinese and the Indians, misread the Malay mind because they don't understand. If you can understand the 4 points that I've just given you, then it is quite clear. If you see some of the statements coming up from Malay leaders, you have to understand it's coming from this sort of foundation.
Okay. Wait 1 second. Let me bring something over.
Yeah.
It's appropriate. Dr. Chin, do you feel that the Malay Dilemma was real after all? Do you think that after all of these years, and by the way, I have like a signed copy. It's actually a very, very old copy. It was actually the last gift, right, that my dad basically left right before he passed away. Then last year when we did the Mahathir interview, I actually got him to sign it. I later got Anwar also to sign this, and they actually signed it with the exact same 0.6 mm outline pen that Anwar used in order to sign his way into the Prime Minister role. But back to the point, right, that you mentioned earlier, do you feel that the Malay Dilemma, right, is still real do you feel that it's kind of like influencing the way that people think, or do you feel that maybe, well, Mahathir at the time had already like formulated an accurate description of the quote unquote Malay mind? Because like, a lot of people like they say that like, oh, like there's no way that it could be accurate. Like it's outdated. Even Mahathir went ahead and disavowed it. So like, I don't know, but like the points that you mentioned, right? This idea that, like Malaysian culture is Malay dominant culture, something that, of course, like Mahathir had almost like certainly believed, right, when he was writing the Malay Dilemma, and that maybe even goes back to the time when he was studying in Singapore and, just facing the indignity of being a B student and being mistaken as a driver, that kind of thing. The idea of being too selfish to share commercial knowledge, accusing non-Malays of not wanting to assimilate, and saying that non-Malays are challenging the social contract, right? All of these, right, like they seem very, very similar to what is described in this book. So is this book really a statement of like the reality that we live in that Mahathir had predicted, or like did it influence people to like start taking on and living out that self-fulfilled prophecy over all these years?
So I think the first point I want to make about the Malay Dilemma is that it is a unique book. It is a unique book in the sense that he is the only Malay political leader that wrote his political philosophy before he got into power. He wrote the book when he was out of power. What is not widely known was that he wrote some of the chapters when he came to Australia for an academic visit. This is not widely known. He was actually invited to be a visitor in Australia when he was out of power. He came over because the reason I know about this was because he showed some of the draft chapters to one of the person who arranged the visit, and I interviewed that person.
Whoa.
So what is interesting about this book is that, he sort of lay out very, very clearly his philosophy, his political philosophy. And if you look at all our other prime ministers, no other prime ministers have laid out the political philosophy like the Malay Dilemma. I think at the end of the day, Mahathir has gone the full circle. He has come back, and I think he truly believes today at age 100. He still believes that a lot of the points he made about the Malay Dilemma is correct. One of the most important interviews he gave after he stepped down the first time was he gave a series of interviews to Japanese newspapers. As you know, Mahathir has always been very, very close to the Japanese. He saw the Japanese culture as the culture that the Malays should copy. But of course, he was very angry that the Malays were not industrious like the Japanese. That's why he scolded the Malays as being lazy. But in one of the interviews in Japan, and for whatever reason, it's never been translated in English, they asked him what were his biggest regrets. He said his biggest regret was that he was never able to change the minds of them. So in other words, what he meant was that the Malay political psychology, the one he wrote in 1970, was exactly the same after he left power in 2003. So despite being in power for more than 20 years, pushing the Malays, trying to industrialize the Malay, trying to make them change their outlook in life, he was not successful. So what does this tell me? This tells me that, in places like Malaysia, right, it's extremely, extremely difficult, to change culture. And I'm not talking only about the Malay culture. If you look at Chinese culture and Indian culture in Malaysia, it's also very, very difficult to change. One of the interesting things about living in the West, I always tell myself the big difference between living in the West and living in an Asian society like Malaysia is that in many parts of Asia, right, people take their culture and their religion seriously. So, for example, you live in the States, right, people don't take their culture seriously. So, for example, in the States, right, people say that, oh, you have, shades of Italian culture if your background is Italian, or Irish culture, whatever. But in Malaysia, right, people take their culture, and especially in the last 20 years, they take the religion seriously, especially Islam. And that's the reason why I spend a lot of time trying to explain to fellow Malaysians, right, about the rise of political Islam. But the sad part about Malaysia is, of course, that the space for rational discussion is getting less and less. Because anybody who talks about Islam, even if not about the religion. So, for example, if you read all my writings about political Islam, right, I never go into the theological aspect. My definition of political Islam is very simple. That politicians or political party use Islam as a rallying point. So I don't go into theological aspect. But the problem in Malaysia is that the moment you talk about anything with the word Islam in it, right, and if you're non-Muslim, people will accuse you of being anti-Islam immediately. So
Mm.
therefore, it is not possible to have a rash discussion. And yet, you and I both know, if you look around us, right, the biggest change that has happened since Mahathir stepped down is the rise of political Islam.
Mm.
And I can prove it very easily. The biggest party in the parliament today is PAS. And what does PAS stand for? Political Islam and nothing else.
For
I
sure.
mean, from day one, PAS has always wanted to sell Negara Islam. That is the only product they're selling. They're not selling any other product. And I can prove it very easily that political Islam is the biggest fault line in Malaysia, because the second biggest party in parliament is DAP. And what does DAP stand for? DAP stands for middle of the road, right? Multiracial Malaysia.
Mm.
So you can see, right, two very distinct ideology which has no middle ground. One is for political Islam, Negara Islam. The other is for middle of the road approach. So it is quite interesting that Mahathir spent all his time when he was in power trying to use Islam to modernize the Malay community, and yet after he stepped down, his successors lost control of political Islam to PAS, the party that he was trying to use Islam to fight against PAS. So life is full of irony.
It is, yeah. And I want to circle over to a bit of an interesting point here. So then there's this idea really of Mahathir being this individual personality, right? That really shaped things. But then at the same time, right? So you've talked also about how, well, it's very difficult sometimes to shape people along the way. But there's a bit of an interesting point there with Mahathir recruiting in the first place Anwar Ibrahim. That whole process was set into motion right after, well, Mahathir said, oh, look, here's a good Abim leader. Why don't I recruit him and then bring him into my party so that we can compete with PAS on all of these Islamic credentials things right here, so that we can convince people. And here we are today with this thing that you call, if I'm not wrong, I could be misquoting you, one of the greatest challenges in Malaysian politics today. So I don't know, Prof, do you feel that Mahathir had a role really in shaping the direction of how things move? Or do you think that somehow or another, even if you went back in time and then somehow you were a time traveler and then you made Mahathir become an actual doctor and then stay a doctor for his entire life right there, do you think that things would have become what they are? Or do you think that his presence really still ended up shaping things to some degree?
In some ways, I think that this discussion, what if, is not a really fruitful discussion. But I think what is very clear is that Mahathir, as you mentioned, brought Anwar in because he wanted to use Islam as a political weapon, political Islam against PAS. The point I'm trying to make was that after 20 years of using political Islam, he was able to control PAS. When I say control PAS, in that he was able to make sure that PAS was never able to break out of the four Malay states, Terengganu, Perlis, Kedah, and Kelantan. PAS was confined to the four northern Malay states. And after he left power, right, his successors lost control of the political Islam thing. So that's the reason why PAS is now the strongest party in the Malay community. The point I'm trying to make is that Mahathir started this political Islam thing because he thought he can use political Islam not only to win over the Malays politically, but to change the cultures of the Malay to make them more industrialized. Because one of the things, if you read all his speeches, when he speaks to an Islamic crowd, when he was in power the first time, he always made the point that, in the old days, in the ancient days, the Islamic civilization was even better than the Western civilization. For example, key areas like astronomy, mathematics, the Islamic world were really far, far ahead of the West. And he put the blame, on the clergy class for stopping the progress of the Islamic world. And but somehow this message did not sink into the Malay community. I would argue it's because of the Malay culture. But then after he left in 2003, his successors were not able to carry this through. Because you can see very clearly, right? They understood the risk of political Islam, because one of the things Badawi did after he came to power was Islam Hadari, right? People forgot, his core philosophy was Islam Hadari, but that was never accepted by the right-wing Islamic groups. They undermined. Okay, and when Najib came in, Najib was even smarter. He decided not to play the Islamic card. He decided to play the economic card. He brought in the new economic model, NEM, all that sort of thing. But of course, Najib was a bit naughty. He got himself involved in one MDB and the story. I don't have to repeat the story. So he was never given a chance to see through his new economic model.
I see.
But basically, my point is that Mahathir started political Islam. He lost control of it. For lack of a better analogy, he tried to ride the Islamic tiger. He managed to ride it quite well for 20 years. Then when he got off, his successor tried to ride it and they got eaten up by the Islamic tiger.
I see. Wow. Yeah, I mean, we did see actually Najib try to ride it to some degree when he brought in the Rohingyas and then gave Zakir Naik permanent residency. So like that is pretty interesting to think about. But Prof, to sort of transition, right? So you saw the clip of Mahathir crying. You see him now also like, trying to create Malay umbrellas. You can see a whole lot of rallies going on.
Melayu berdaulat, Melayu berdaulat. Kita tak akan khianat dan zalim orang-orang bukan Melayu ataupun orang-orang bukan Islam kalau yang berkuasanya ialah dari kalangan orang Islam. Kita perlu tahu siapa tuan rumah, siapa tuan tanah.
Like Himpunan Melayu Berdaulat, as if somehow or another, like this whole process, right? These institutions that Mahathir and the people who came after him built, right, are somehow still not enough to ensure the sort of society that he envisioned or wants even now. So it's very interesting to like think about that. Why do you suppose that he feels the way that he feels right now? Because like if you look at the objective fact, right, of like the Malaysia that we know of right now, leaders of GLCs are Malay, are Muslim. Like there is Malay political control, and there are so many other things, right, that are institutionalized into like the very way that this country works. So what do you make of this trend, Prof, whereby the Malays seem to think that they are very weak, even though the objective evidence seems to suggest otherwise to an untrained observer?
So basically, Mahathir is playing on the fear of the Malay community. I think this is the most powerful weapon in the Malay community. The two really powerful weapons in the Malay community, you can sort of call it the positive and negative side. The positive one is political Islam. You make them more religiously conservative. The fear side is that you play the Chinese as the boogeyman. That if you give the Chinese an inch, they will take a feet. So the thing is that this has proven to be very, very successful. So Mahathir is using it not so much against the Chinese, but he's riding on this wave, hoping that eventually it will lead to the ouster of Anwar. As I mentioned, Mahathir has always been consistent since Anwar was sacked as his deputy prime minister. He's always made it very clear that he's always seen Anwar as somebody who's morally unacceptable to the Muslim world to be a prime minister. And he always reminds people that Anwar was found guilty of Sodom. So he said that this is not acceptable in the world, and and he has always made it very clear that if he has to, he will do everything in his power to pull Anwar down, and that's exactly why.
Now let's transition to an interesting part then, Prof. Do you feel that there is any grounds for this view? Like, is it justified in any way? We see that right now Anwar Ibrahim is the Prime Minister of Malaysia. Of course, like a lot of people, they hold this kind of view in the past PN community. And like you can see, like literally, like ever since Umi Hafilda appeared and like stood testament, ever since 50 Dalil was published, right? Like people have had these sorts of suspicions here and there. And like even now, you can see that, well, the Malay community, right? Like if you look at like the comments and like the reactions on Facebook, right? Like you will see that like almost anything that Anwar Ibrahim posts, right? Like you will see laughter emojis like everywhere. So like, well, there's a distinction, of course, between like how somebody appears to people and how they are. But like, Prof, what's your evaluation, I guess, of like this whole Anwar and Mahathir dynamic? Like, do you feel that it was based any, I guess, well, not truth, right? Because truth is like hard for us to like really tell. But do you think that there was anything valid about it?
I think it really doesn't matter. It depends on who you speak to. So, for example, in the non-Malay community, in all my years of interaction with the political class, non-Malay political class, even the ordinary people, my personal friends, right? They always say that we don't really care about the private lives of our politicians. As long as they do a good job, the most important thing is that for the non-Malay community, they want rational government decisions, not based on race and religion. They want economic prosperity, and on top of the list, they want anti-corruption. They do not want corruption.
Absolutely.
Right? But if you speak to the Malay community, it's sort of different. Their number one priority is actually that Malaysia should be ruled according to, I wouldn't use the word Islamic laws, but, it should be ruled in a very conservative way that doesn't langgar Islam. And also for them, right, the morality thing is very important. They don't distinguish between the private life of a political leader and his public act. But in some ways, what you mentioned to me about all the negative comments in Anwar's social media posts, that is to be expected because if you combine TKR or Pakatan Harapan Malay votes with UMNO Malay votes, right, they only come up to maximum 35% of the Malay community. So 65% of the Malay community actually with Bersatu and PAS. So, so this is the biggest problem that Anwar faced. How can you rule Malaysia if the majority people do not support him? So that's the reason why he spends so much time trying to pick on subjects which he feels that appeal to the Malay community. So, for example, he has taken a very high profile on the Palestinian issue because he knows it's very popular in the Malay community. And also, one of the first things he did, which created an uproar in the non-Malay community, so he said that he wants Jakim to be a central agent. Jakim should go beyond its religious stuff, go in the economy, go in the public policy. So he's doing everything he can to win the Malay vote because I think he understands that, if he loses the Malay vote the next round. So the way to understand Malaysian politics now, Malay politics, sorry, is actually very simple. If you look at the map of Malaya, right? So as I mentioned, right, PAS for the very first time since 2018 have broken out of the four Malay states, Kelantan, Terengganu, and the Perlis and Kedah. They're sort of moving down. And the line drawn now is basically Selangor. In the next general election, if they move further downwards from Selangor, Malacca, all the way up to Johor, right, then Pakatan Harapan will be in big trouble. They really have to, rely on Sabah and Sarawak to get over the one or the minimum bare minimum. So he's doing everything he can to sort of to stop the rise of PAS. PAS is very interesting in the sense that, in the last few years, they have sort of modified their message. For a very long time, they were playing the political Islam card. Now, they're doing a bit of both. They're saying that we also have, for the very first time last year, they're saying that we are attracting more Malay professionals compared to UMNO and Bersatu, which is really interesting. Now, whether it's true or not, I'm not too sure, but it seems that, PAS has sort of changed slightly their messages. The big advantage PAS has is that, all the people who went to the religious school, the Tafiz school, right, in the last 20, 30 years, they're all voters now. So they have built a bank of voters who are now able to vote, right? So we know that in the last round, right, one of the interesting things was that all the urban so-called NGOs promoting this idea of Undi 18 try to get they thought that the younger people will not vote for political Islam, when in fact they all went and vote for PAS. So this is the reason why I always tell my friends in Kuala Lumpur, be careful, right? You think you know what's going on the ground. You think, oh, young people are like this, young people are like that. You shake the tree, you don't know what's going to fall out of the tree. So it's quite dangerous. So sometimes in Malaysian politics, you have to be very careful because we don't live in a single bubble. We sort of live in three separate bubbles. And this bubble, they bump into each other all the time. The first bubble is, of course, the Malay world. The second bubble is the non-Malay world. And the third bubble is Sabah and Sarawak. So these are three very distinct bubbles. And sometimes whatever you do in one bubble, it will have a totally 180 degrees different reaction in the other two bubbles. So you have to be very careful in politics.
Absolutely. And speaking of carefulness, I'd like to transition over to the DAP right now. Now, in a recent interview, you mentioned actually that the DAP recently won a victory because, well, they now have 2 Malay members in their Central Executive Committee. And, well, it seems that given the demographic changes that are happening right now, like there's definitely this sort of move to adjust towards that. Do you feel that, well, DAP is really up to the task of, well, asserting its role, responding to the demographic challenge, and then in even Sabah and Sarawak politics?
So the DAP is not a kingmaker in any sense of the word. The starting point for understanding the DAP was that in 2018, when they were given a very important position, the Minister of Finance and a few other key positions, right? In fact, because they were seen as too assertive, that was one of the reasons why the Malays turned against the Mahathir administration second time around. So the DAP this time has taken off sort of a very quiet position in government. They've not really asserted themselves. They are not kingmakers, but they understand this golden rule that if the other side, Perikatan, if they get the power, right, they won't have a place on the table. The only chance they have for a place on the table in government is through Anwar Ibrahim and Pakatan Harapan. So that's the reason why, at the end of the day, my argument has always been that when it comes to push to shove, they will not abandon Anwar Ibrahim because there is no place for them on the other side. And you know, in the Malaysian system, right, if you're not in government, right, you cannot do anything because we live in a situation what we call strong state. If you're not part of the government, you really cannot do anything at all. So the DAP is caught in a no-win situation. Every time Anwar does something that is very pro-Malay or pro-Islam, the DAP cannot to be seen to be fighting it because Anwar has to win the Malay vote, right? He doesn't have the Malay vote. But on the other hand, DAP faces a lot of pressure on the ground from the Chinese, the urban area, and said that we did not vote for this. We vote for, reformasi. We do not want the same thing that happened Barisan era. But I think my take on the DAP is very simple and it's quite a controversial take. A lot of people disagree with me. My take is that the Chinese community collectively, the psychology of the Chinese, and here I'm talking about the Chinese in Malaya, not in Sabah and Sarawak, they sort of put their basket, the entire political basket, into the DAP basket basically from 2008 to 2013 onwards. So that's the reason why by 2018, right, a lot of people argue that more than 90% of the Chinese voters in Malaya supported DAP. There's no space for anybody else, right? So my take is that the Chinese sort of put all their egg into the DAP basket, especially from 2013 onwards, and they've given the DAP 20 years to show that they're very different from the MCA stroke Gerakan. Because previously, 30 years under Mahathir, they put all the egg into the Gerakan MCA basket, hoping that, these people can really represent Chinese interests. And because they didn't do such a job, and, they were, for lack of a better word, they were regularly called the running dogs of UMNO. The Chinese have sort of totally abandoned them. So the Chinese today, I would argue that because of long experience, negative experience with Mahathir, they are only willing to give DAP 20 years. So the DAP is good in terms of the Chinese vote for the next two general elections. If the DAP cannot represent the Chinese, or the Chinese think that the DAP cannot represent them, then two general elections from now, the Chinese will be looking for a new champion. So the Chinese in some ways have no loyalty to the DAP. They're supporting DAP because they try the other side, it doesn't work, so we're going to all out for DAP, for these 20 years and see what the DAP can do. So really, in some ways, you can argue that the DAP is in a very precarious position because their success depends on how much concession Anwar or Pakatan can give them. If Anwar and Pakatan do not grant them enough concessions, or the Chinese thinks that the DAP slowly turning into quote-unquote MCA 2.0, then the DAP will be out of power in 10 years.
Thank you for that. And so when we look now, in fact, at the DAP, right, we see a push almost into East Malaysia as well. And the reason I started seeing this actually was because of DAP rep Violet Yong, which I'll go ahead and show on the screen. There's a whole discussion of like gerrymandering, and then like you added in like all of these seats right here. And I know that this is your area of specialty, Prof. So what's going on with that? And do you think that the DAP is likely to succeed in Sabah, Sarawak?
The DAP has already succeeded in Sabah and Sarawak. So, for example, if you look at the upcoming Sabah election, right, I can guarantee you most of the Chinese seats will fall to the DAP. It is only in Sarawak in the last state elections where the DAP settled a sort of setback that ended up with only 2 Chinese seats. But prior to that, they won most of the Chinese seats in Sarawak. So basically, the Chinese in Sabah and Sarawak has also sort of moved towards the DAP in the last few years, except for Sarawak. Sarawak is very different for many reasons, but the major reason why Sarawak's political culture is very different is because the sense of state nationalism or Sarawak nationalism is very, very strong in Sarawak. And part of the reason why it's very strong is because the core Barisan has never been in Sarawak, right? There's no UMNO branches in Sarawak. There's no MIC branches. There's no MCA or UMNO in Sarawak. So the Sarawak parties have always had sort of a freedom to build up this very strong sense of Sarawak nationalism. In terms of DAP moving into East Malaysia, in some ways their ideology is quite attractive to the Chinese over there. But the problem is that when the politicians in Sabah and Sarawak play the card, Sabah for Sabahan, Sarawak for Sarawakians, the DAP has never been able to give a convincing answer why we must be part of wider Chinese party called the base. Because the answer, the DAP critics in Sabah and Sarawak say that, there's nothing with you if you want to follow the DAP in Peninsular Malaysia. It's just that we prefer a locally based Chinese party. So why don't you guys get out of the DAP and form a local Chinese party? Then we will double our support for you, right?
I see.
So this is the problem with this state nationalism thing, that the DAP has no answers. So the danger for DAP in both Sabah and Sarawak is that with the rise of state nationalism in both Sabah and Sarawak, right, one of the key casualties will be Pakatan Harapan and Barisan Nasional.
I see.
So, for example, in the upcoming Sabah election, right, UMNO is very worried because if there's a very strong Sabah for Sabahan sentiment in the upcoming election, right, UMNO, will be in big trouble because UMNO has quite a stranglehold on Sabah politics, and this is one of the few issues where they cannot answer. They cannot say that why they must take orders from Parliament.
I see. Cool. Thank you for that. Prof, and by the way, to all the viewers here, I think that James is probably the only person who actually has sent me academic papers before a podcast discussion. And I don't know if I'm one of the few people who actually read the papers, but I haven't read the papers. And I want to ask you about a statement that you actually made. So then you're talking about this Sabah Sarawak sort of nationalism kind of thing, right? And I find that interesting because in the end of your MA 63 paper, you actually also mentioned something that I found a bit disturbing. You said, and I quote these words, "The harsh reality is that Putrajaya will not allow Sabah or Sarawak to exit the Federation without bloodshed." So then, now, I'm wondering, right? Because you wrote this paper back in 2019. Do you think that that's still true today, even under the Madani government, where Nurul Izzah Anwar is going out to rallies and then basically saying we must collect information, we must go out and then we must win this election because that's her, major test. It's her, crossing the Rubicon or something else out there, the thing that showcases that she can really occupy the throne. So what do you think of this, Prof?
I stand by what I wrote earlier for the very simple reason that Sabah and Sarawak has all the resources that the country needs, especially oil and gas. So there's nowhere that political establishment or the Malay establishment in Peninsular Malaysia will allow Sabah and Sarawak to break away. Part of the reason is a recent history. The Malay establishment in Malaya has never forgave the Tunku for allowing Singapore, Malaysia. Because we know back in 1964-65, right, if Tunku had used the security forces, he could have stopped Singapore from leaving because Singapore had no arms. So in the case of Sabah and Sarawak, it's very easy to use the security apparatus to stop Sabah and Sarawak, the Federation. If you look at all the army camps, security camps in Sabah and Sarawak, they all control direct Putrajaya. There is no way they're going to allow Sabah and Sarawak without bloodshed. But that is a separate issue. So the only way, I made the argument, the only way that Putrajaya can sort of make peace with Sabah and Sarawak is to recognize the list of historical grievances and deal with them. What we have at the present moment in Putrajaya is that the Malay establishment, not the Malaysian political, but the Malay establishment has this, this dilemma facing them. On the one hand, they understand the historical grievances of Sabah and Sarawak, how they've been marginalized last 60 years. They think that, yes, you guys have been marginalized. We won't say openly, but we know we took too much of the resources. We blame everything on Mahathir. He took the money, he took the money from Sarawak and then for the oil and gas, and then he built one of the towers, Petronas Tower, paid by Sarawak Oil and Gas, and the second tower was built by oil and gas from Sabah. So, KLIA, New Putrajaya, Capital, all this was built by oil and gas money from Petronas. And right, the bulk of Petronas resources are from Sabah and Sarawak. So they understand it. So they said, okay, we want to make it up to you guys. We want to give you more money, give you more autonomy. But on the other hand, at the back of their mind, they're thinking that if we give you too much autonomy, right, we are helping you to succeed in the future. So when you find the right balance, and at the end of the mind, there's another big problem they cannot resolve, which is that if we give you guys too much autonomy, then what will happen to states with very strong sense of state nationhood? Things like Johor and Kelantan, right? The Johorians and the Kelantans have very, very strong state identity. So what do you do with them? Because Johor has been pushing for autonomy for a very long time as well. Kelantan, in fact, have filed lawsuits against Putrajaya over oil and gas, which is not widely known. So you can imagine that, if we give in to Sabah and Sarawak, then these two states will also try to say that, how come we can't have autonomy as well? So this is the dilemma facing the Malay political establishment. But in my interactions with them, they always tell me that they recognize the historical grievances. It's just that they cannot find the right balance. They are afraid that if we give too much, you guys are on the way to creating a state within a state, which eventually may lead to succession, or the Kelantanese and the Johorians will come to us, and in the end, the federalism will be a very weak federalism. What they don't understand, and I keep emphasizing to them, is that, for a real federalism to work right, there must be a clear separation of powers between the federal government and the state government. What we have in Malaysia is a centralized federation, where the federal government is too strong. They take away the states, right? They take away the interest of the state. All the successful federation in the world are where, there's a sort of a 50% power lies in the federal government, 50% lies in the state government. And unfortunately, the Malay political culture does not understand that. And again, you have to blame it on Mahathir, because Mahathir was the one who centralized all the powers in Putrajaya. Well, in fact, he built Putrajaya so he can understand it.
All right. Thank you so much, Prof. And to end our discussion, be mindful of time. So then, I know that you're from Kuching, Sarawak. So this last question is going to be related to that. We know that, Sarawak recently has made a lot of strides in English education, crafting this brand new culture, and I think that it's the only state, right, that has its own distinct state education department, which I've always found to be very interesting. I think it's something to learn more about for the entirety of Malaysia and everything else as well. But I guess, Prof, what do you think, realistically will be the outcome, right, of this sort of wish for historical grievances to be resolved along the way, the realistic sense? And then a next part of that would then be what do you hope for as a Sarawakian, for, Sarawak or, Sabah, or for Malaysia in general to develop in the years to come?
Oh, that answer is very simple. I just wish that the Malay establishment in Malaysia, the one who holds the real power, right, understand that Malaysia will be a very, very successful country if there's a balance of power between the federal government and the states is number one. Secondly, Malaysia will be a much more successful country if we go back to Malaysia, the P. Ramlee days. In other words, that we recognize, at the end of the day, Malaysia is a multiracial, multi-religious state. If they keep harping on trying to build a state which is basically, a Malay Islamic state, right? They will get there, obviously, because of changes. They will get, but it may not be a successful state as, as I said, if it was a recognition that this is a multiracial, multi-religious state. You have to remember, right, if you try to build a Malay state in Malaysia, right, then I can guarantee you this will not be accepted by the Sabah. See the problem? There's an inherent contradiction in this. push for a Malay Islamic state because you're saying that there is no space for Sabahans and Sarawakians because they don't fit into this ideal Malay Islamic state. You can build it in Malaya, no doubt about it, because you are the absolute majority, everything. I don't doubt it. But I'm just saying that if you do that, then the people of Sabah and Sarawak feel that there is no space for them. And we know, looking at successful countries around the world, in fact, how should I put it? We don't have to look very far. You can see that, even in the region, right? You can see that Indonesia has really transformed itself in the last 20 years, especially after the fall of Suharto. Indonesia is basically recognized that it is a very fixed state. I'm sure many of your viewers know that Christianity is recognized, through Christianity is recognized as official religions in Indonesia, right? And other countries in the region, right, they're going to run a lot faster. And if we don't get it right, we still harp on race and religion. The other countries are going to overtake us in the next 10 to 15 years, and Malaysia is just going to regress. And I can tell you for a fact that, it's very easy not to see this in front of us, because what will happen is that all the talent will just disappear. People will just leave the country, and that's it. You see, people don't realize that when a country slowly goes down. I have lived in a country that nearly fell off a cliff, nearly became a failed country. When I look back at the time when I was living there, I didn't see in front of my eyes. Very often, right, when you are living through the process, you don't see in front of you. You only see it when you leave the country. You leave the country for a while and then come back and suddenly say, what happened? And that's the reason why you look at a lot of the Malaysians who moved out of Malaysia in the 80s, after the NEP was brought in. A lot of them set up their careers overseas. So now it's about 40 years later. Now retirement, when they come back to Malaysia, right? When you talk to them, they can see a lot of things are not happening in Malaysia. Physically, I think we're doing quite well. We're building roads, hospitals, schools, everything. But in our political culture, I think we really have gone backwards. And as I said earlier, the unfortunate thing is that culture is the hardest thing to change, and political culture is even harder because you've got people in Malaysia reinforcing the race and religion narrative, and they're reinforcing it in a very clever way and in a very successful way. And this is reinforced by all those private schools that's been set up left and right, especially the madrasah. They're turning out people with a certain worldview. And unless the government deals with this in a serious manner, I think it'll be problematic.
All right. Professor James Chin, thank you so much